I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also, and from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate that. Hey, top of the morning. Happy, is this the 4th of July weekend? Is next weekend 4th of July weekend? It's a weird year. I think 24 is a leap year, so next year it's just one weekend again, because it'll go to Thursday. So anyway, if you're here for the very first time, welcome. It's great to see you and be with you. For those of you who are maybe family in town, it's always a privilege to get to connect with you in these ways. I'm reminded, actually this morning I was reminded as that was being read, the first service of like this journey we're on is so incredibly difficult, and I myself am quite terrible at it. Because I knew that what I was teaching on this weekend, but I apparently forgot that yesterday. So my youngest plays for the Legion team. He was on the reps, and he threw a gem yesterday in GVO against a pretty good team. They should have won the game 1-0. They lost 2-1 on a couple errors, but the thing that really cost them the game was a really bad call at home in the bottom of the 7th with 2 outs. And so I know at this field where the umpires exit, and so I jumped up after the game was over, and I happened to be right at the spot where they'd be crossing in the grassy green boulevard, and as they walked by me, because I really liked the strike zone of the one guy, it lent itself to my son's style of pitching. I said, "You guys called a great game together," and you could tell he was just about to say thank you, and then I said, "But you blew it on that call at home." And then this morning, actually right away I was like, oh, because actually what made it worse is then afterwards I was talking to the coaches and I was like, man, that was a terrible call at home, huh? And they had a different angle than I did, and they said, oh no, he was safe. So I'm really not bragging. I've actually thought like, man, Lord, I feel terrible, and I hope you just help that guy recognize that I'm an idiot and not think too much about it. But this is hard stuff, and I say all that to say like, I can't think of something in the present state of our world, socially, politically. I don't think it would matter what time we lived in. I actually can't think of a more difficult thing to be asked to live out than what it is that we're going to talk about this morning, and this idea of love your enemy. And I think there's a small part of it that what makes it really hard is we understand that means different things for governments and militaries, and how do we apply this to abuse in the home, and how do we apply this to the mistreatment of other humans, and that I get that's a real thing, and we really have to think intelligently about that, but I'm not convinced that's really why we've avoided this. I think the bigger reason is we just don't like it. In fact, I was thinking yesterday, I've started studying for Advent in my own personal time, and the third Sunday at Advent, the New Testament reading is from 1 Thessalonians 5. We don't have it on the screen, but some of you will know 1 Thessalonians 5. It ends with this iconic section. Verse 16, be joyful always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances. It's like the ultimate memory verse. It's the ultimate like Christian mental health section of Scripture. But you know what comes right before rejoice always? I had no idea until I read this yesterday, and it seems all too convenient that we've just forgot. As Paul's listing out these very practical things to do, here's what he says before he says any of that. See that none of you repays evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to all. I think the fact that that's just forgotten speaks to how hard this stuff is. So let me just explain what gets us here. If you've not been with us, we started this series on June 4th. And really this praying in 4D kind of concept, and what we were trying to say is there are so many aspects of prayer, and there's probably some that we're good at and some that we're not, and some that we don't believe and some that we do, and some that explain why we don't pray, and others that we've maybe never considered. But really where the series came from is as a staff, over the better part of this last year, part of what we read books together and have conversations about them on Thursday mornings, and part of the idea that we've been sitting with is that for most of Christian history, clergy, that is people like me who were paid by people like you to do this kind of work, part of what they understood as their vocational purpose was to pray. And this is, of course, where monasteries come from, especially in their best form. But there was this understanding of, in the same way we go, like, let's set some people aside to do this vocation and that vocation, there was this practice of let's set these people aside. And it wasn't just to host worship gatherings on Sundays, it was to pray for the broader community. And it's daunting, and we explored that at the end of a series last year called Your Mental Game, where we just explored, like, to what extent, if any, is prayer a productive activity? And that means one thing for you, but it means an entirely different sets of things for people like myself and Hannah and Justin and the whole team. Well, that led then to, on December 21st, just looking back at my own kind of prayer journal thingamajig. I'm not much of a journaler, but I take notes and scribble around. And on December 21st, personally, I asked this question of, okay, Jesus, what do you want me to know about prayer? And again, in hindsight, it was reflecting further into this prayer thing, and I think what I was trying to do was simplify it, because the Bible as a whole, has a whole bunch to say about prayer. And it's not that I don't believe any of it, I do respect it, but it's daunting. And there was this desire to, like, how could we simplify this conversation and create a first rung of a ladder, so to speak, if we just said, okay, so really it breaks down into two things for me. How did Jesus pray? And when the Gospels record Jesus praying, what observations can we make? And then second to that, when he taught on prayer, when he spoke about prayer, what does he say? What does he do? What does he teach? And that's led to this series where we started in the first week, and what seems really clear is that Jesus, first and foremost, and this is what we talked about on June 4th, Jesus used prayer to discern the will of God. Turns out, even if you're fully God and fully human, there's this burden of needing to know at times in life, what am I supposed to do here? And Jesus didn't just model, but he practiced, like, who are the 12 disciples supposed to be? Should I get baptized? When should we do the transfiguration? Story after story, what you see is Jesus prayed at these very strategic moments. But then, probably all of our lives speak to this fact that, like, 1% of the problem is knowing God's will, and the other 99 is actually doing it. And what you see in Jesus is prayer was this way of, like, just recommitting himself. He had these daily liturgies, these daily practices of just going like, yeah, God, help me to do what I already know I'm supposed to do. So that was week one. Week two, I thought Gay did an exemplary job of speaking to prayer as a way of being with God. How do we develop a relationship with an typically invisible God? Well, there's this prayer opportunity. And then in the third week, we explored evil, and this was, for me, the shocker in the series, that Jesus is this phenomenal teacher. No one holds a candle to his understanding of the human person, psychologically, relationally, morally. And yet he didn't just see himself as one who was here to die. He saw himself as a warrior, and part of his death was a part of his battle, but that he saw himself as a second Adam who was here to reclaim and win back and defeat this enemy that had taken over God's creation. And within his prayer, you see a lot of focus on evil. It's uncomfortable, and that's what we explored in that third week. Last week, Deidre Casey was here, and she further built on this idea of prayer as a way of being with. And can I just say, like, I'm so proud to be a part of this with you guys, that we could invite a Roman Catholic woman, which in so many contexts are like two checks against, to come, like, speak and teach, and that you would all receive that, and I didn't get a single angry email. It just makes me proud to be a part of this team that we're a part of, and that we all understand that there's lots of good churches in town, and there's lots of different reasons to attend different ones. So thank you for your hospitality towards her. Well, next week we're going to finish, and I'm actually very excited about next week, but here's where the challenge of this week comes from, is I actually didn't study this in the original kind of pursuit of it all. Here's what happened is I was in the gym a couple months ago. I already had this series kind of packaged up. I don't always do a study for the sake of creating a series, but that's what happened here, and frankly, it happens often. I was in the gym, and I saw a particular person who, quite honestly, I know does not like me. I know that's surprising that there are people that aren't, but it's not surprising to me in the least. And to be clear, like, I've sent emails, I've tried to be the peacemaker, I know the situation that created this dislike for me, and I feel like I've done my part, but there's just zero interest in any kind of conversation. And so I was in the gym. I probably see him there once every week or two. And I caught myself for the first time, like, kind of behaving like a 12-year-old adolescent, because there was this like, well, he doesn't like me, so I don't like him. Like, that was what was going on emotionally in my head. And this is why I'm so grateful for the Holy Spirit, because I don't think I'd have come up with this on my own, but there was this, like, while doing leg lifts, there was this nudge of like, wait, we don't do life that way, Adam. And what became a challenge to me was, well, how about this, Adam? Every time you see that person, what if you just made a commitment to pray for them? And I'm not trying to say this to make myself look holier than thou, because I've spent many a times going like, I don't like that guy either, and that's a really bad tattoo, and it's kind of human stuff. But there was in this moment this commitment of like, I'm going to do this. And then I started to reflect on that, and I was like, wait a minute, how in the world did I study Jesus' practice and teaching of prayer for almost 2 months and never study like probably the most radical thing about prayer that he ever said, which is pray for your enemies? I think it speaks to how much we don't like this. And maybe to another extent, it also speaks to the extent to which this isn't woven into the fabric of what we understand it means to be Christian. And yet part of what I want to try to convince you this morning is I can't think of a more difficult, but a more like divinely refreshing trait to breathe into the world than to somehow allow the Spirit of God to form in you in such a way that in evil circumstances or even uncomfortable circumstances, or when somebody, like, that we don't do the tit for tat thing. It's hard to imagine how we could do this Jesus thing any more relevantly than this particular aspect. So I want to frame up 2 questions for you. I just kind of tell you where I otherwise would have ended, because this is where this kind of crashes down for me. Number 1, what do you do with the fact that at any given moment, 10% of your population's mad at you? Now, I realize I'm not taking any time to convince you that's true, other than to say it's true. What do you do with that? My friend Fred, who taught me how to follow Jesus in my 20s, he's the one that introduced me to this concept, and the older I get, the more true it is. And of course, he's talking about everything from your family, to your extended family, to your coworkers, to your neighbors, to your teammates, to your classmates, to your friend group. Like, how do you emotionally sit with the fact, and what do you do in light of the fact that at any given point, 10% of your population is mad at you? Now, I think we could also use this as like an Enneagram personality test, because some of you are like, really, only 10? That makes you type A, Enneagram 1. You're surprised it's so low. And others of you are like, no, it can't be. I got to go take a nap. That makes you the other extreme at Enneagram 9. But what do you do? And part of what I want to suggest is, what if Jesus would have this emotional salve that's called, you don't hide it. You pray for those people. The second part I want to set up before we go to that slide just for a moment, but if it's true that Jesus is a second Adam, if it's true that Jesus is here to take back creation from chaos and evil, then I think there's another assumption built into what it means to be Christian, and it's something like this. Go to that next slide if you would, Bob. What do you do with the fact that as a follower of Jesus, you're called to absorb evil and give back kingdom goodness? And I think this, to me, speaks to Jesus wasn't trying to create an easy, weak movement. Like, he has a way of calling people to this 1% kind of standard, which doesn't mean I think that it's an elite thing, but it's a hard thing. That what do you do with the fact that at its very core, what the cross is Jesus absorbing evil's best punch and giving back God's best version of grace. And therefore, Jesus' vision for you and for us as followers of Jesus is this crazy way of being human where you learn to, like a tree, you take in evil. And again, I get there's nuance around this in areas of abuse and government and military and all those things, but you take in evil and you like give back the pure oxygen of grace. And what if part of the reason Jesus says, pray for your enemies, is because he knows that bar is so stinking high that absent this constant focus with God, you're just not going to get it done. Let's jump in. But I say to you that listen, and go ahead to that slide. I say to you that listen. Let's just stop there because this word listen, I think, demands a little bit of attention. If you're not familiar with the Gospels, anytime Jesus uses the word listen, he's cueing you into, he's about to teach something that's really difficult. It's like, okay, you're 13, you've mastered the art of hitting fastballs, let me introduce you to the curveball. Like you're about to do something very hard. Jesus in the Gospel of Luke uses the word 17 times. Cumulatively in the 4 Gospels, it's just short of 50 times. It's related to, we studied this in Matthew when Jesus says, whoever has eyes to see and ears to hear. It's related to why Jesus taught in parables. It's not that he was trying to be coy, but it's that he accepts that his way of being human is going to require maximum mental energy, like maximum focus and attention. I'm not a hunter, some of you are, and I hear you describe what it's like to have a bow in your hands, and you know what like strict concentration looks like. I think in terms of mountain biking. If you're familiar with hiking or running or biking the trails, you may be familiar with Eddie East and Eddie West. There's, I don't know how many switchbacks. It's a very difficult section of trail. It's very fun. I've been trying to challenge myself there because I need work on my switchback riding, and I learned last week, my friend John Dorn, he calls it switchback camp. But there's, especially if you're going from west to east, if you're going up Eddie East, I have counted those because I always want to keep track if I'm done yet. There's 11 of them. And my friend Chase would say they're not built necessarily very well, so a couple of them are super tight and really hard. And if I'm going to make those switchbacks, it requires like every little fundamental that I know, like don't white knuckle the handlebars, get your hands loose, get your knees out, lower your seat about an inch, like all these things. And even then, it's about a quarter of the time that I make 2, 3, and 4. Those are the hardest ones. But here's what happens to me that gets really frustrating. It just happened to me last weekend. When I give all this effort and all this energy and I make all 3 of those, what often happens is like switchback 7 or 8 or 9, I blow it. And they're actually not that hard, but they're still relative to switchbacks, they are. And I think what's going on there is, like, I got mentally lazy. Like, you work so hard on these few, and then you let your guard down, and then it's so frustrating. Like, seriously? Like, you've learned to hit curveballs, and now you get this, like, easy, and you strike out on that? That's kind of what it feels like. I think what Jesus is saying here is, hey, this is now advanced stuff. This is hard stuff. And, of course, you already know what he's going to say, but let's just look at a few of those. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. I mean, look at the verbs there. Like if he just stopped at love, then most of us could go like, oh, it's Hallmark, it's sentimental, like, oh yeah, love your enemy, just like smile in your head at them, even if you really want to flip them off. Like that would be what it amounts to. But he doesn't leave it at that. I mean, look at it. Love, do good. Now we're talking tangible action, aren't we? Bless. Again, that could be arbitrary, but then pray. And what's interesting about this one to me is, like, part of the question built into the question for us around prayer for the last year has been, to what extent, if any, is prayer a productive activity? And it would seem that Jesus is going, and this matters. This is hard. Now, who does it benefit? When you pray for your enemy, is that about them? Is it about you? I have a friend who told me he prayed every day for a year that he could forgive his ex-wife before he felt any kind of emotional success there. So who benefited there? Did she? Did he? Or is it just yes? Like, did the world? We have one less bitter person in the world? Did their kids? Of course, all these are yes. Who benefits when we pray for our enemy? It's this broad thing, and yet difficult. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. Now this, I have a transactional way of viewing the world, so I try to be really cautious with myself when I start viewing God through a purely moralistic, good, bad lens, and that word credit kind of triggers that for me. Like, I like this, okay, but there must be something else going on here. Well, the word credit, it's actually the word charis, which if you're a scholar, which I don't expect that any of us are, I'm not, I'm just a plagiarist, but the word charis is the word Paul uses in the New Testament whenever he's describing gifts of the Spirit. So what's he saying there? When you love those who love you, what's he saying? Like, or you could ask it this way, do you need God's Spirit in you to do that? Does anybody? No, like, so from Jesus' perspective, you might be able to go like, so what might be one of the ultimate tests that in Paul's language you're actually living in the Spirit right now? Would it be that you speak some foreign language? Would it be your ability to feel the music? Would it be the warm fuzzies that come with a good quiet time? What's Paul saying here? Or excuse me, what's Jesus saying here? Maybe the ultimate evidence that you're walking with the Spirit in this particular moment is that you don't stop the umpires after the game and tell them how bad of a job they did. Maybe the ultimate test is actually the opposite, that somehow something gives you vitriol, it gives you negativity, it gives you hatred. And I think we can challenge ourselves too to go, this can be embodied, but it can also just be symptomatic of evil. I think it could be cancer. I think it could be tragedy, suffering. This call to somehow take in the worst version of evil and give back. And you go like, well, that's ridiculous. I think that's Jesus' point. You're not going to pull it off. It's why the vision, it seems to me, remember Jesus says, hey, in a little while, I'm going to be gone, at least in this like visible form, but it'll be better because I'm going to send the Spirit, which you go like, well, that sounds like hyperbole. Unless it's not. Unless the divine plan was that God would like send his Spirit into you and get you to be him in ways you couldn't be him without him. Listen to the way he continues into this. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. You see, this is like, why do you think you're special if you're doing that? Everybody loves the umpire when your team wins. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you'll be children of the Most High, for he is kind, here it is, to the grateful, ungrateful, and the wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful, which I think leads to this question, what's his ultimate motive for doing this? Is it ultimately like your own emotional health? Is it the health of your relationships? Is it the impact that'll have on culture? Sure. I think those are all part and parcel to a bigger truth, which is like God's plan for being present in your school, in your neighborhood, at your place of work, in your system of relationships, in your family. God's plan for being present there is what? This is the scary part of the Christian life. It's you. It's that he would be present in you, and you would this is the divine conspiracy. A God that they kill in physical nature, thinking they get rid of him, but he like reappears, so to speak, in the form of people. And people show up at the office, and people show up in relationship, and people show up in marriages, and people show up in the park, and people show up on the teams, and in so doing, God is there. That's the divine conspiracy. I was listening to C.S. Lewis. There's this podcast that I just learned yesterday is put out by the Unbelievable Network, which is out of the UK. And Alistair McGrath is this guy who's, I think he has a PhD. I know he's around C.S. Lewis theology. He wrote C.S. Lewis's most recognized biography. And they were interviewing Alistair McGrath. I think there's like 100 of these podcasts, but they were asking Alistair McGrath about C.S. Lewis. And if you're not familiar with him, I'm sorry. Arguably the most influential theologian of the 20th century, or certainly he's in that conversation. And what he said is actually C.S. Lewis was really bummed when he became convinced of God's existence and Christianity. He was such a committed atheist that he was disappointed that he came to this place where he believed this to be true. But the way Alistair McGrath explained it is, he was so familiar with all the mythologies and all the philosophies of the world that having sat with them as this Oxford professor, when he finally realized the scheme for human existence, the narrative, the story, the perspective that makes more sense than any other, was the Christian story. And when he realized that, he was bummed. It's why he would call himself a confessional Christian, meaning he became convinced it was true, but he didn't think of himself as a real Christian for a couple of years because he realized he still had to bring his life into alignment to that. It's not just a matter of believing these facts. And I wonder if we're not really close, if not right in the middle of the bullseye. That Jesus has this view of life that says that the most true statement about God's nature is when you get life's worst. And because the Spirit of God in you, like metamorphosizing that vitriol, is able to breathe back out pure oxygen. Which leaves me with two questions. Number one, what do you do with the fact that at any given point, 10% of your population is mad at you? And how do you potentially take Jesus seriously enough to know, like, he knew this was the human problem and praying for said people was paramount, it was central within the solution? And second, and if you're not a Christ follower, then you get an out on all this really, but especially the second one. What do you do with the fact that the air purifier God had in mind for culture was you? I'm not convinced anymore that the times are that much different than they were 10, 20, 50 years ago. But I am more and more moving towards this, like, we have to stop pointing out how broken things are. Because they're broken. But Christians' job is actually to be a part of the solution, but to do this in this cruciform way. That we take it in, and because we've so built our life around the presence of God in us, that we're able to give back. Like, we shouldn't be surprised when people without the Spirit of God breathe back the same toxicity that they breathed in, should we? Which means that the point at which there's someone to be indicted, I think it's me. I think it's you, to the extent that you're his. Like, you're God's plan for a different culture. It's not a government. It's not some anointed leader. It's not some new system. It's not some weapon. It's the accumulation of people who believe in the historic death and resurrection of Jesus the Messiah, who see in him this completely different way of being human and understand that they're going to take up their own cross and do the same. But to say, like, I'll treat them well when they treat me well is like the greatest of ironies coming out of the mouth of a Christian, isn't it? So what do you do with the fact that God's plan, at least in part, for dealing with the world's evil is your own little personal prayer closet and the one we share together in gatherings like this? We are going to give you a chance to take communion this morning, and I think it's so appropriate as Annie and John come back up here, because I can be smug on this one because I've been a part of these conversations for decades where it's like, how do we lead people to this point of decision at the end of a service? And how do we raise hands? Do we sign cards? Do we have them come forward? But within the historic church conversation, they saw Eucharist, communion, as a weekly communion. It's this recommitment to the cruciform life. And so if you're here for the first time, if you're an active follower of Jesus, then you're welcome to take it with us. You don't have to be a member here. Just please, by all means, you're welcome. We'll have, just to help you explain what's going on, there will be bread over here and wine and juice over here, and we'll go a row at a time. So you'll kind of figure that one out. You're not obligated. We get the rows make it awkward. We're sorry. It's not our intent. But if you're active in following Jesus, you're welcome to take it. What we'll do is everybody will get their bread and wine, and then I'll jump back up here and we'll all take it together. Also want to say, I think it's wise to use this time to know God's forgiveness. And we know God's forgiveness, we learn this from the Gospels, by first knowing our own need for it. And so to just create space for God to draw out where you yelled at umpires this week, and you need to own that. Also, I think just please feel what it is that we're doing, that the Christian life is saying, God, you've said that if I give it to you, you would take my life. and you would fill it with your Spirit, and you would send me back into the world with greater purpose and meaning. And in the same way, we're taking bread and wine and saying, God, in these mysterious ways, your presence shows up in this. Would you send your Spirit into it and it into us and feed this cruciform life that we're called to? So I'd like to pray, and we'll give you a chance, should you want to get your communion. God, Lord, we just, some of us, not all of us, and that's okay. Some of us are still on a journey, and we know that sometimes it takes years, but for many of us, Lord, this is God, we're recommitting our life to you, that you would take our ordinary, everyday, kind of left to ourselves, pathetic selves, lives and persons, and would you send your Spirit into us so that you show up in where our feet take us. And in the same way, God, would you take this bread and this wine, would you send your Spirit into us, your presence into us, and feed this Jesus life that we just probably wouldn't be here if we're not either committed to or interested in. And Jesus, I just thanks that you love us enough to give us such a high calling as to breathe your grace into the world. Amen.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook or Instagram.